Sadness and outrage tonight after another school shooting in America.
Good afternoon, this is News 2, and we're following a breaking story today, a shooting at a high school in Littleton, Colorado.
There's word potentially multiple children have been killed. This happened at the Robb Elementary School in the Uvalde Consolidated Independent School District.
2012 Colorado movie theater massacre.
7 bodies were discovered in Oklahoma.
2 mosques in Christchurch were targeted, the country's worst mass shooting ever.
On September 27, 2004, a young woman's body was discovered off of a highway in northwest Arkansas. The body was identified as Rebekah Gould, a 22-year-old college student studying at the University of Arkansas in the town of Fayetteville, Arkansas. Her body was found near her hometown, which was also located in the same state, about 3 hours away from her university. Rebekah grew up in a quaint town named Melbourne. At this time, in 2004, Melbourne was home to around 1,670 residents, so needless to say, it was a very small town where most of the residents knew each other. Rebekah was born on September 25, 1981, and grew up with her 3 sisters, Gabrielle, Tiffany, and Danielle. Their parents split up when Rebekah was young, but her bond with her sisters only grew stronger through this hard time in their lives. All reports mention that Rebekah and Danielle were especially close. Danielle was younger than Rebekah, and many described them as being each other's best friends, although all 4 sisters were really close. In mid to late September 2004, Rebekah drove back to Melbourne from Fayetteville with Danielle. They were sharing an apartment there, where they also attended their universities. The 2 girls were visiting family and friends on this short trip, only having been in school for a short time at this point. Only 1 week into her visit, Rebekah mysteriously vanished a few days before her 23rd birthday, never to be seen alive again. During her visit back from college, Rebekah was especially excited to see her boyfriend, Casey McCullough, so she spent the weekend with him at his single-wide mobile home in the city of Guyon, which is about 17 miles south of Melbourne. As far as I could find, the 2 had been dating for around a year at this point. On the morning of September 20th, 2004, Rebekah allegedly drove McCullough to work at the local Sonic drive-in, where they had actually met. McCullough apparently needed a ride because his truck was not currently at his home. After dropping him off, Rebekah stopped at a local convenience store to grab a coffee and a small breakfast for herself. She then headed back to McCullough's home to pack her things up. Danielle, Rebekah's sister, was expecting her to show up sometime in the afternoon to make the drive back to Fayetteville together. It's a little foggy, but as far as I gathered, it was either September 20th or September 21st when Rebekah was reported missing. I was unable to find any discernible reports that said either or. Either way, it was when she failed to show up for her sister or get into contact with anybody that her family grew worried. They reported her missing, and the police arrived at McCullough's house on September 21st to perform a welfare check. Rebekah's car was found parked outside of the house, so it seemed likely that she was still there. It was during this visit that authorities found a gruesome scene occupying the home. They found that the interior walls and floor were spattered with blood. There was also a noticeable blood trail running through the home, as well as a bloody mattress that had been flipped over along with bloody pillows stuffed under the bed and bloody sheets in the washing machine. The police also noted that all of Rebekah's belongings were still inside the home. Her phone, purse, clothes, and even her unharmed dog were there. Her breakfast sandwich she had purchased on the 20th was also found uneaten. The only thing not found in the house was Rebekah herself. Authorities also discovered bleach in large amounts throughout the house, suggesting that the attacker attempted to clean up the scene at some point. Obviously, the police quickly wanted to locate Rebekah's boyfriend, McCullough, to ask him some questions. He denied ever coming home on September 20th, the day she was last seen alive. Allegedly, he was out with friends after work that night and ended up staying over at one of their houses instead of returning home. After all, Rebekah was supposed to be leaving that afternoon, so he wouldn't really have a reason that he needed to go back home. But as it turns out, McCullough had a dog, and many people thought it was weird that he didn't go back that night to check on it, at least. After all, his place of work was not so far away that it would be a huge inconvenience for him to swing by. McCullough was declared a person of interest, but was never formally identified as a suspect, and was quickly ruled out due to his alibi, which seemed solid. On September 27th, Rebekah's body would be discovered. She was found wearing only a t-shirt and a pair of underwear. Her body was found seemingly thrown off of a 35-foot embankment on the side of Highway 9, somewhere in between Guyon and Melbourne. As far as I could find, the murder weapon was not found by police at the dump site. There was no actual attempt to conceal the body, other than it being behind some trees. It was also evident that she had been there for a while, from the state of her remains. The coroner determined that she had likely been killed on the day she was reported missing, due to the decomposition and the insect damage done to her body. Rebekah's sisters heartbreakingly recount that day. Quote, "On the day the police found Rebekah, we went back to our motel in Melbourne, unable to process the fact that she was dead. Still in a state of shock, we sat down in the middle of the parking lot in a circle. Sitting in a circle, all of us facing each other, was our thing. It was all we knew to do at that moment. It was our way of giving Rebekah the only memorial we had to give, our sister circle. As we sat in silence, looking to each other for comfort, Danielle looked up and said, 'Where's the fourth? Hey, you know, she should be sitting here with us.' That says everything we need to say about our bond with her. Her murder left a literal hole in our circle." The sisters did everything in their power to share Rebekah's story, desperate to uncover the answers that many people were searching for. Who killed her, and why? They worked with investigators, gave public interviews, and opened up social media pages in honor of Rebekah. The autopsy report done on Rebekah indicated that her cause of death was blunt force trauma on the left side of her head. They determined that Rebekah likely suffered 1 or 2 blows from a solid object. Her hyoid bone in her neck was also found broken, which is a strong piece of evidence to suggest she was also strangled. Although she was found in her underwear, no signs of sexual assault were ever found. This suggests that Rebekah was likely dressed this way during her murder, which means she could have been comfortable around her killer. Police continued to put effort into finding Rebekah's killer, but sadly the investigation was leading nowhere, and it was soon declared a cold case. Many theories sprung up throughout the investigation, some which sounded like they could be plausible. One of my references, a podcast with the name Hell and Gone, was very useful during my research. It was around the 14-year anniversary of Rebekah's murder that the host, Catherine Townsend, and her crew went on a months-long journey to find and follow any lead they came across. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the events in the podcast or their exact findings, or we would be here all day, but I will list some of the most important information. The crew tracked down and interviewed multiple people, most of which were either persons of interest or locals who knew Rebekah or the people of interest. They were also able to work with an investigator and true crime journalist by the name of George Jared. Jared was one of the first journalists to cover Rebekah's case, and had been present when her body was found. He really did a lot of the footwork in her case. Jared was joined by Jennifer Buchholz, another investigator that took interest in Rebekah's case. Sadly, at the time, the police who had jurisdiction on her case were not as proactive as many would hope, and they rejected offers for outside individuals and agencies to assist them. In the podcast, they locate several people and put together a list of theories along with other general information gathered. The thing is, McCullough's house was located pretty much in the middle of nowhere. It was close enough to the town, but it was definitely off on its own. Many of McCullough's friends didn't even know where he lived. It was becoming more clear that whoever killed Rebekah knew where she was, and most likely knew that she would be alone. This really narrowed the suspect list down. It had to be somebody that knew where the house was, had knowledge that she wasn't accompanied by anybody, and that likely was trustworthy enough for her. Catherine Townsend did her best to get into contact with McCullough, but by this time he was married and had children. Shockingly, he lived with his family in the same house where his girlfriend was murdered 14 years prior. They were unable to get a hold of him until much later in their investigation. The podcast's crew was not convinced of McCullough's alibi. They thought that the police did not do a good enough job of verifying it. They talked to several of his family and friends. Most described him as a good guy and lovable to Rebekah. But when speaking with her close friends and family, they state that McCullough was controlling and manipulative. The crew also learned that not only had McCullough not attended Rebekah's funeral, but he was also not even part of the search when she was still considered missing. All of this information really gave them a bad feeling, but there still was no hard evidence to point to him. When Catherine later talked to the friends that McCulloch was allegedly with the night before Rebekah died, they said that he was acting a little strange. When he found out that Rebekah was missing, he didn't make any move to rush back to his house like they assumed he would. There's a lot more information about McCulloch, but I'm going to move on for now. Another theory was that an old friend of Rebekah's named Jennifer killed her because she was jealous. At the time of her murder, Jennifer was dating an ex-boyfriend of Rebekah's and was currently pregnant with his child. They had reportedly had a messy falling out and had been fighting before. There wasn't any physical evidence to prove this, but really, there was no physical evidence left by the killer, regardless of who they were, so anyone could have been responsible. Helen Gaughan's crew attempted to track Jennifer down to speak with her, but they learned that she had since moved to Florida, so they were unable to get a hold of her. Rebekah's dad, Dr. Larry Gould, received a letter at one point, where the writer claimed they overheard a group of nearby college students talking about the murder. The author of the letter was unfortunately never identified, so no further information about these students was uncovered, nor was this letter ever verified. According to multiple sources, one being the Helen Gaughan podcast, friends of McCulloch said later he claimed to return to his house the morning after her murder. Apparently, he had to run back to his house to get a change of clothes for work that day. McCulloch allegedly said he failed to notice the crime scene inside the home, though. That information is obviously suspicious, as virtually the entire home was covered in blood. Also, close friends remarked later that McCulloch was not one to hang out with friends out of the house often. For the most part, his friends were surprised he had gone out with them that night. There is a plethora of information in the Helen Gaughan podcast, so please check it out if you want to learn more, though. Do be aware that a lot of information is out now compared to when the podcast was released, so some information is incomplete or not accurate. It was during January 2020 when Arkansas State Police Special Agent Mike McNeil was appointed as the new lead detective. McNeil is also credited heavily with the work he put into the case. The previous lead detective seemed to not be making any progress with the case, but when McNeil was appointed, the case began to advance quickly. He said later that he immediately treated the case as if it had just happened. He also said that he went back to McCulloch first, to rule him out himself, but after examining evidence and conducting multiple interviews, he was convinced that someone in the family was involved. He testified later, quote, "I felt like the person responsible was a McCulloch, or someone related to the McCulloch." Together, the two main private investigators, Jared and Buchholz, continued to work together to weed through all of the case's information, re-examining the known details, as well as searching for new information. "We used open source information," said Buchholz. "We did not have a case file." Not only did they go through the written statements and details, they also conducted reenactments with theorized weapons and dummies, attempting to recreate the supposed injuries. Jennifer Buchholz also taught classes on forensics, so she was well versed with the subject. Along with George Jared, Buchholz founded the Unsolved Murder of Rebekah Gould Facebook page in November of 2019. The people in this group were dedicated to uncovering the truth about her death and finally getting justice for Rebekah. This Facebook page quickly gained traction, and a global audience grew exponentially. A man in his 40s, named William Miller, who was living in the Philippines at the time, joined the Facebook group shortly after its creation. Miller immediately seemed particularly invested in the case, providing his own theories all while discussing the case in detail with several other members of the group. According to Buchholz and Jared, during their panel at CrimeCon 2021, Miller claimed that Rebekah was involved in a love triangle with McCulloch, though there wasn't any other information found to suggest this. The two of them spoke a lot about the case, as well as Miller's claims and comments throughout this panel. Jared later remarks, quote, "He kept saying things to us that were very, very suspicious." Miller would often put his own detailed thoughts into the comments on the Facebook page. In January of 2020, Jennifer received a direct message from Miller. He was inquiring with her about reports of screaming that neighbors heard the night of the murder, which was published in the local newspaper at the time of Rebekah's death. Miller seemed even more interested in the case and continually made efforts to brainstorm with Jennifer about what could have happened. He also would say things like, He hopes Rebekah finally gets justice someday, that her family deserved to know who killed her. His presence in the group was growing, and other members started to take notice of his unusual interest in the case. A while after the DMs continued to come in from him, Buchholz found out that William Miller was, shockingly, actually Casey McCullough's cousin. It was at this time that she realized Miller might be siphoning inside information to McCullough, so she was careful with her responses when conversing with him. She and Jared also started to consider the possibility of Miller being involved in some way, so they provided all useful information to McNeil, including the comments on the page and the DMs they had been receiving. It was November of 2020 when Miller was arrested. Authorities began to monitor Miller, who had recently moved to Oregon, and they took him into custody shortly after. I'm not sure what exactly made them arrest Miller, as I couldn't find any source that stated what the reasoning was. Either way, they say that he later confessed to the murder of Rebekah Gould. Miller lived in Texas in 2004, but was visiting Arkansas during the time of Rebekah's murder. From what I gathered, he was there to assist his mother and brother in moving to Texas. According to McNeil, Miller had stopped by McCullough's house briefly the night before to speak with his cousin. McNeil conducted an interview with Miller on November 7, 2020, in Oregon. The interview, which later turned into an interrogation, lasted hours. In the beginning, McNeil spoke with Miller for over an hour, before asking Miller to take a polygraph test. He reluctantly agreed and ended up failing the test. After this failure, McNeil turned the pressure up. He entered the room with Miller once again and confronted him with photos of the truck that Miller owned in 2004, as well as a picture of a bloody rag found at the crime scene. He told Miller that the killer's DNA was on the rag and that Rebekah's DNA was found near the gas pedal of his former truck. Neither of these claims were true, but it was just enough to make Miller begin to talk. Miller suddenly claimed that he was on the property behind the house when he saw two men on the back porch of McCullough's trailer the morning of Rebekah's death. He said that he followed one of these men into the trailer, and they both took off. McNeil already knew this was a blatant lie, so he interrupted him, quote, "What you are saying is absolutely ridiculous. Tell me what you did." Flustered, Miller requested to step out of the room to talk to his mother, and when he returned, he confessed.
Just tell me. Tell me what you did, how it happened.
Can I speak to my mom outside? You can look at me, and I'm not going to run off or anything.
Listen, let me do this. Let me bring your mom in here, and let's talk to her together, if that's what you want to do.
I want to talk to her outside. Outside, and I promise to come back in here and tell you whatever you want. Let me talk to my mom, please. Please, that's all I'm asking.
We're going to get your mom, and we're going to step out into the salad port, and you're going to tell her what you're going to tell her, and then we're going to come back in here.
Okay.
All right. Okay. I'll get Jeremy in a minute. We get to have a conversation. I held up my end of the deal. Let's talk.
What do you want me to tell you?
I want you to tell me what you did, how it went down. One thing about this is it's been reeling in your head like a movie reel since it happened. There isn't anything about this that you forgot. I know that because I've been doing this a long time.
I'm just going to tell you that I did it. I did it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did.
You got to tell me how it went down. Because
I'm just going to tell you that I kind of blocked it out of my mind in a way.
The exact timeline is vague. No one really knows the exact details surrounding the murder, but according to his interrogation, the timeline goes as follows. Allegedly, Miller was hunting on the property near McCullough's home that morning. He parked his truck in the field behind the home, and after he finished hunting, he walked to the front door of McCullough's home and knocked on it. Rebekah answered the door, and Miller introduced himself as McCullough's cousin and requested to come inside to use the phone. While Miller pretended to use the phone, he observed Rebekah go into the bedroom, assuming she had gone to lay back down. Miller claimed the urge to kill overcame him. He described it as a light switch that just went off. Presumably finding this an opportune moment, Miller retrieved a nearby leg from a piano which was already loose, and he made his way into the bedroom. Once inside and finding Rebekah laying down, Miller proceeded to strike her with the piano leg. After hitting her twice in the head, Miller claims that he wrapped a necktie around her throat and began to strangle her. He also recalls part of the attempted cleanup, telling McNeil about how he stuffed some bedding into the washing machine. After he was satisfied, he rolled her body into a blanket, left the home through the back door, and loaded her into the back of his truck. He then made his way to the site where he dumped her body. Miller says that, in the middle of the day, he drove through town with her body in the back of the truck, even passing the police station. The dump site was not planned according to Miller. He claims that he was freaking out at the moment and just chose a spot at random. According to him, this entire ordeal lasted 15 minutes or less. He also says multiple times during the interrogation that there is still physical evidence that hasn't been found yet, but he is willing to show investigators what and where it is. I was not able to find any information to further back this claim up, so I'm not sure what came of it, or if it was even real. Some details of his confession don't line up with the known facts of the case, but the essence of his statements are true. For example, Miller claimed that Rebekah was laying down when he began to attack her, but the injuries she obtained suggest she was standing upright when she received them. There was never an apparent reason for the murder. Miller had little to no explanation for it at the time of his confession. He also denied sexually assaulting Rebekah. Miller apparently also confessed to at least 5 other murders, taking place in Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, and Oklahoma. I'm not going to go into detail about these supposed murders, as I am focusing on Rebekah today, but I just wanted to throw that in. At his trial, Miller's defense team argued that he was not properly Mirandized before his interrogation, and therefore it should not be admissible in court. Thankfully, the judge ruled that the confession would not be suppressed. Everyone was relieved with this ruling, especially Rebekah's father. After his imprisonment, the only explanation Miller could give for this brutal murder was, quote, "She said something to me, and it just infuriated me." He later claimed that he couldn't remember what Rebekah had said. Miller also stated that he believes that the attack resulted from being beaten as a child by his father. In October of 2022, William Miller pleaded guilty to 1 count of first-degree murder in connection with Rebekah Gould. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison, and he is currently serving his time at the East Arkansas Regional Unit. It took 16 years for Rebekah's killer to be caught. Many people are frustrated with the lack of progress the former lead detective made, as it only took McNeil 9 months after he was appointed to make an arrest. After all, her killer being caught and brought to justice is a huge win for everyone involved, especially Rebekah's family. They are obviously relieved to have finally found out the truth. I'm very sad to say that the Gould family has since lost another family member. Their sister Danielle, who, if you remember, was Rebekah's best friend, the one who she lived with while they were in college, unfortunately passed away in late February of 2023. This is obviously heartbreaking, but I'm glad that she was able to be here to see her sister's killer be put to justice. As always, make sure to keep Rebekah and her family in your thoughts, and thank you for joining me for this unfortunate story today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you've heard about this case before, I hope you learned something new from my video.